questions from the audience. So let me turn now to the audience and remind you that there are stand-up mics at these two ends, and if you want to ask a question, please go to the mics, and there are two others over there, and so you will line up, and I'll call people in turn from these mics. And please remember a couple of things. Keep your questions brief, and try to make them end with a question mark so that they really are questions. So let me begin with you.
Hey,
and
good
please
evening.
introduce yourself quickly.
Hey, my name is Pedro. I'm here with the Future Society. And I think we had David Kenny from IBM here in our fall event. And he made a comment that I think is very pertinent to this discussion about bias. And he said that artificial intelligence will take care of the boring stuff, the boring jobs, so that we can focus on the creative stuff. And I think there's a very heavy assumption there that tells us that everyone can do the creative stuff if we remove the boring jobs out of the equation. And I think that's very relevant to this question of these vulnerable populations that will be directly affected by this removal of the so-called boring jobs, because we're assuming that they can do all these creative things and that there will be enough creative activities for everyone to partake. So the question is bringing to the present today, right? What are these decision makers doing at present in order to mitigate, in order to help the populations that are most vulnerable and who will be mostly affected, right, by this AI revolution, so to speak, however it may take place in the future?
The protection of vulnerable populations. Who would like to take on that question?
Yeah, well, I can't say I have a smart answer, other than to say that I'm certainly one of the economists who also believes that technology likely plays a more important role in kind of displacing people compared to, for example, immigration or other forces that we might be concerned about. So I do think it's a huge concern, and I wouldn't subscribe to the argument that was made earlier saying, you know, it's all wonderful, and the new jobs will be jobs that everyone will want to and can do. So I think, honestly, I don't have an answer other than to agree with you that I think it's real. I think that's what the numbers tells us too, that there is some displacement from technology. There's also, of course, new jobs that are created through technology, no question, but these are quite different jobs. And when we look at, you know, the sectors that have been growing in the United States in the last 5 years, it's basically two sectors. It's the technology sector and the health sector. So, and the health sector will just increase, will just increase to grow as we're getting older, et cetera. But that's, I think, a very interesting question of so in the health sector, I'm actually mentioning the health sector because many of the new jobs are caring jobs which cannot be done by machines, where we actually need people. And an equally important question for me is, can some of the people who are now losing their jobs actually retool, not in terms of creativity or not in terms of, you know, advanced tech or something. They don't need to become computer scientists, but more importantly, can these people, can they retool and become caregivers, a job for which there's a lot of demand and for which we actually need humans?
So we study jobs and things using big data, because that's what we do. And I suspect that the way we think about this is completely screwed up. We think about it because we are in a frame where it's sort of the industrial age. You get more education, you get more money, you get a higher status job. But when we actually look in many societies, education is a relatively small effect compared to, for instance, diversity of interaction. So if you're an entrepreneurial type that is connecting people, you often make as much or more money than people who are highly educated that are somewhat less connectors. In some of the societies we've looked at in this country, there's a national survey of skills, and those skills can be mapped onto jobs that are likely to be automated. And the fastest, highest remunerative skills are these connector skills. So they include some technical stuff, but it's the entrepreneurs, it's the people that are headhunters, it's the people that are finding opportunities that are the fastest, highest paid categories. So one can imagine a vision of the future where it's not isolated individuals with lots and lots of degrees making money, but it's really people looking for opportunities, connecting people within society, connecting opportunities with other people, that are the place where the population will move, and that might actually end up being good. I don't know if I'm expressing that correctly, but it's a different way of thinking about what society is really doing that's sort of post-industrial.
Let me turn to this side of the room.
Hi, my name is Nico. I'm one of the co-founders of the Future Society and also a proud fellow with the Sheila Jasanoff Program on Science, Technology, and Society. My question is predominantly to Sandy and Cynthia in regards accountability of algorithmic governance. One of the key things that we see with the rise of advanced machine learning techniques, and particularly deep learning, is a certain manifestation of the question of the black box, which is, simply put, that we don't quite get to a deep understanding of the set of correlations that are done within the so-called hidden layers of a machine learning algorithms that lead to an output. And so if I'm, let's say, a citizen or a customer in search of a measure of my risk profile for access to credit or insurance, we tend to lose sight of what drives the algorithm to a certain measure of that risk, which comes with the pricing. So there is a source of potential bias there. So how do we, I wouldn't say technically, how can we go about designing open algorithms or closed algorithms, because some of them carry a commercial tension? You know, there's a trademark there. How can we make machine learning algorithms more accountable while we don't know how they process information at the core of them?
Cynthia, do you want to take that?
Great, I'll give a controversial answer. I'm not sure you want to, and I'm not sure the concept makes sense. So I gave as this example, it doesn't even make sense if you have a rich description of people to say, well, we'll just change the sex. Right? You can't be the same person and have a different sex. That your sex, affects so many aspects of your life. So what does it mean to say that sex or gender is driving the algorithm? It's completely unclear. Now, first of all, when you're asking why was I classified this way, why was I turned down for the loan, for example, is that really the question, or is the question, what could I do that I could afford to do that would lead to a different outcome if I reapplied? I want this loan. I want to get into this school. What I'm really interested in knowing is what's a path to a different outcome that I can actually realize. And that is something that actually makes sense mathematically. Now, there is a tremendous amount of interest in so-called comprehensible classifiers. And I don't understand them yet. I'm studying these things, and I'm trying to understand them because I don't. What does it mean? Does it mean that if I've designed the algorithm, I show it to you and you can examine the code and say, this is okay, this line is okay, this line is okay? The lines of code interact in ways that are pretty difficult for any human being to simply look at and make a judgment on. And I'm working with a student now to experiment in exactly this kind of thing. So I don't know what it means to be comprehensible. Perhaps the right definition is that you test it on lots and lots and lots of different data and sort of see what's happening. I'm not sure. I haven't seen that definition in the literature. And then there's the question of whether it's the right thing to do for accuracy. So if somebody has an algorithm that is not well understood but does a really, really great job of predicting risk of a cardiac event, maybe that's the one I want to use, whether the doctor understands why it said what it said or not. So I just have a whole bunch of questions around this topic. I know that a lot of people are believers. I haven't seen the math yet that convinces me.
Let me give a slightly different but similar answer, actually, which is I don't think that it's possible to understand these algorithms in the way that people typically mean the word understand. I do think it's possible to debate whether, to look at what they do and debate whether that's what you want to have happen. And to do that, you need to understand their performance along different dimensions. So are there outliers that are different than the current system? Are there, does it seem that the decisions place more weight, and there's nice statistical ways of answering that, more weight on sensitive variables? It's not necessarily bad, but one wants to have a debate about whether that's the society that we want. To go to your point about values, is this moving in a direction that we want to have? And so the question around algorithms is this something that's performing the way that we as a human society want? And of course, there's the question of what do you mean we, right? But you know, we've wrestled with that for thousands of years. We'll continue to wrestle with it. But
what about the time span dimension? That is, over what sort of period of time is it's working or not working, making itself manifest such that the corrective actions could be taken?
Well, there's a sort of technical answer which has to do with do you have enough samples to be able to say something that's statistically valid, assuming that you've got a certain noise in the system and stuff like that. In the thing that we're doing, it's a continual reevaluation. But obviously, if there are no more cases than the last time we considered it, you needn't do any more because nothing happened. But I actually think that that's an important element is any of these algorithms, just like I would claim any law, should be continually reevaluated because the world changes. You know, laws are algorithms, and they're executed by bureaucracies, which are like computers but noisy, right? And one wants to have a continual oversight of that to make sure that it's doing what you intended.
Well, of course, with laws, we actually do have a judicial system that does some of that oversight, and people look back and they can say, no state has actually carried through a death penalty in X many years, and therefore society has voted with its feet,
and so
we don't
one
do
would
this.
expect that, for instance, a governing body of sort of approving algorithms would have similar oversight of its behavior.
Algorithmic approval of algorithmic behavior?
Well, no, of judicial approval of the decisions made by, you know, the algorithm legislature. It's all to be determined.
Let me turn back to the audience. Yes, up there.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm a senior at the college studying government and computer science. So kind of a follow-up to that question, one of the salient questions that's come up as we have more non-human actors making decisions that we consider to be human, so the example of the self-driving car, and how they make the decision of, you know, am I going to kill this person or am I going to save the driver? And even though the developers of this technology feel that this will be a lot less common once we have more AI-based cars, where do you think those decisions or the accountability for that should be coming as we think about, I think Professor Bohnet was talking about utilitarian versus Kantian principles that we build into our products. Do you envision, as we move forward with more AI agents, that accountability coming down to the developers, private companies, states, and have you in your professional lives seen those conversations happening?
Who would like to take that?
I mean, not an excellent question, a very, very important question. So I might want to distinguish between kind of two kinds of issues that we want to think about. The first one is kind of maybe, I was going to say, unconsciously getting this wrong. I'm not literally meaning implicit bias, but some sort of unconsciously kind of misprogramming something. And I'm actually building on what Cynthia just said before. So one question is, are we actually experimenting enough to know what the impact of the algorithms are? And I'm an outsider to this, but it is, I think, for all of us always a bit surprising of what we find, that search mechanisms then default people who look for Charlotte into Charles, and I mean, do many worse things. where it feels like, well, that could have been tested. That's not such a hard thing to kind of find out. So I think one thing that's not yet accountability, but I'm just thinking in terms of best practice, we collectively really have to do a better job kind of understanding what works, what doesn't work, and run many, many more experiments. I think then there's another question of kind of conscious bias, and that is that we target certain groups of people with certain ads based on their demographic characteristics, and I think that's where kind of accountability through the law comes in, or maybe even through democracy comes in, that we might want to say, we don't want this. We don't want African Americans to be targeted with information on incarceration. I mean, a true example. So that's a value statement that we as a society can make, and I think it's a political statement that somehow has to come through the political or the legal mechanism. That's, that's another way of accountability. And thirdly, although this is going to be kind of almost a wishful thinking that I've heard Cynthia, is I have been hoping, that transparency will help. But I'm not so sure now, because the complexity is so enormous in some of these mechanisms that I'm now kind of just rethinking my own thinking. As in, how much can we really get with transparency if, at the end of the day, maybe only the developer knows some of the intricacies of the, of the machine or the self-driving car? I don't know. Do you think transparency is going to help us?
I've raised my questions, and I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
So I helped design the autonomous driving algorithms for Nissan Renault. And the decision was that you couldn't make those decisions as a designer, which meant the human had to always be in control, except in very limited situations. So for instance, if somebody's playing on the railway of a subway, like someplace where it says no humans, everybody knows you're not supposed to have a human, and they get hurt there, there's broad agreement that that's their fault. It's not the fault of the person that designed the railway. Until we have consensus like that among society, within society, so that people broadly know what's good, what's correct, and what's not correct, you can't give autonomy to machines. So, for instance, for Nissan Renault, the first sorts of things will be self-parking within controlled spaces that say, no humans, danger, risk of death. And the hope is that people will, accidents may happen, but the hope is that people will understand that it was the fault of the person who went there against all declaration and attempts to prevent them, rather than the fault of the self-driving vehicle. But those are the only sort of cases where you can really give any sense of autonomy, I think, to these vehicles.
Cynthia.
There are some optimists with respect to the self-driving vehicles. Daniela Rus at MIT expressed the opinion that the world would be so well instrumented that the vehicles would be notified long in advance of the risk. So I don't know.
The thing is that I think that will happen, but it'll take a long time. And in that time, people will become educated about the capabilities of these things and the moral dilemmas, so that they understand what that means to be autonomous. And they're probably, like it used to be, that people would get run over by horses and carts because they didn't understand that standing in the road would get you killed. Mm-hmm. And after about 50, 60, 100 years, people figured out that standing in the road is your fault, not their fault. And people don't play in the streets anymore.
Of laws to make it that
Of course,
way.
yeah.
So
it's interesting that the autonomous vehicle, which always becomes the accountability case study, always points people's risk sensibilities in the direction of the victim who's accidentally going to be hurt and not the person who was left without a job, which is where we began this Q&A session. But that may be also a bias that we need to think about. But let's come back to the audience.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm in the physics department, and there's a lot of really good thoughts that I wanted to maybe push to the next level, sort of in your appeal to radicalism. And that's with deep learning and the idea that it's no longer possible to even rationalize necessarily why decisions are being made, and how do we necessarily build a regulatory framework around that, right? So there's still this assumption that, you know, the programmer has some kind of ability to control what the outcome is, but now with image recognition, for instance, being better with deep learning than a human, right? And with deep learning networks, designing deep learning networks, it's not even possible. I don't even think it's knowable to know, for instance, how some of these decisions are being made, let alone being able to control it. And consumers are voting more and more for the technologies that make things more optimal. So for instance, let's say you have a scheduling algorithm for triage in an emergency room, right? And eventually it will probably be shown that an algorithm can do this more efficiently than somebody standing there. And so even if we agree as a society that this is better overall, somebody may be chosen to live versus dying, and we've decided collectively to vote for this as consumers. But how do you hold accountable, and whom do you even begin to think of what is accountability in that case when the decision can't possibly be known and there's no people? It's not that far away, right? I mean, I dispute a little bit the idea that this is decades in the future.
So still in a situation like that, you've trained the algorithm and you use the words efficiency. That implies an objective function that you trained it against. So
let's say maximizing lives, right? But choices still get made.
Wait.
Yeah.
So you said there is a criteria that you're trained against. So that's what you were saying. What are the values that we're trying to achieve with this algorithm? Are those good values? Are those the ones we want? And then comes the question, how well does it achieve those values, and are there exceptional cases? Both of those are fairly well formulated. Sometimes they're difficult to answer if you don't have a lot of data. But there's nothing mysterious about those two questions. Now, how that algorithm actually works is completely mysterious. But I don't need to know that. I need to know what it's trained to do and how well it does it.
And all I'm saying is if it does it better than a human on average, but yet the algorithm decided that my child has to wait 5 minutes and my child dies, who do we hold responsible and how do we think about it? That's all.
Well, that's why in the car case, we decided that humans would always be in the loop and that the human could always override and never to give full autonomy to the car.
In the interests of fairness, let me see if I can get one or two more questions in.
Thank you very much. My name is Przemysław Pałka. I'm a visitor at the Berkman Center. And my question is about the political tools we have in the struggle towards less biased society. Because we see that on the descriptive level, when we let machine learning go, it will replicate the societal bias, both the machines used by the private sector, Google Ads, and the public sector in law enforcement. And so if our goal is to have these machines not replicating the bias, being fair, whatever we mean by that, we agree on that through the societal dialogue. One question is about the technical tools, what we can do, and this is a question in itself, it's complicated. Let's assume we can at least go more towards more fair algorithms, and let's assume we have those tools. What is the fact is that development of these tools is costly, and ex post liability for the entities that use those algorithms will not always serve us, because we might very often not even know that there is a bias in ads, in law enforcement, etc. So assuming we have those tools, or at least we are able to design those tools, what do we do to convince the actors that use algorithms to actually invest and take the cost of developing it? Do we go for administrative law? Do we need a new agency? Do we rely on civil society? Do we need a watchdog?
Why don't we toss the question to the panel?
Sure.
Of course, you offer them freedom from regulatory concern. You say, here's a method that is going to handle bias, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. We will take that problem off your hands.
Maybe let me actually, I'm going to give transparency another try here. I haven't quite given up on transparency. So, and in fact, Sandy made me think about that. We don't need transparency necessarily around, here's why I was thinking this. So, in terms of medicine, testing medicine, right, we have found a way to do this without actually knowing what's in it. There's no transparency around the specifics of the drug. But we're testing of whether the drug is working, for which people it is working, for which illnesses it is working. We have Food and Drug Administration, we have a regulatory process, we have clinical trials, we have a framework which helps us understand when something's working and when it's not working, and at which point we're willing to allow it, so to speak, to be given out to the people. This is, this is me, the economist speaking, who has no clue of computer science, but I could theoretically kind of imagine that maybe we could do something like this, where we don't need the transparency around the ingredients of the algorithm, but a much better process that tells us on how to test the validity, the impact of the algorithm, and that may be the way to go.
So let me take one last question up there, please.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm a sociologist with Microsoft Research. I wanted to see if you guys could distinguish between individual bias, like a police officer deciding to pull over an individual person, versus something like an institutional bias, like flooding particular neighborhoods with police officers as concerns for the design of AI and the implementation of AI. How does an institutional problem come up in the design and use of AI versus a individual bias?
Your question has this hidden variable called the values. So it's not necessarily bad to flood a neighborhood with policemen. Let's imagine that we know that there's an escaped murderer running around there. You'd probably like to have a lot of policemen to catch them. So you have to, I think, ask, what are the values that you're trying to preserve? And as you were saying, how does this action move towards those values or not? And that, to me, is I think you said this also, or something like this. That's the way, the rule against you that you judge bias. Is this doing what we want to do as a society, or is this causing us to deviate from our values? And that's a complicated question. But that's, I think, again, I like to always go back to the values that we're trying to achieve. Again, not trivial, but and measuring algorithms against that is, again, that's sort of the thing. Is this doing what it's supposed to be doing? Is this what we want it to be doing? It's a complicated question. It requires a lot of evidence. It requires debate, because it's not a simple question. It's not a simple, oh yes, 0.8, sort of answer.
Cynthia, do you have any different views about individual, institutional?
I've thought a lot about the difference between individual fairness and group fairness. And so very intuitively, individual fairness means that similar people should be treated similarly, whereas group fairness talks about the statistics as a whole. So for example, group fairness in college admissions would say that the pool of admitted students has the same demographics as the underlying population. That's a group notion. And if you have a classification task where you actually have a way of measuring for this task how similar two people are or aren't for this task, then you can now start proving some theorems about when individual fairness implies group fairness, or the extent to which it doesn't if the two groups are very, very different, have very different profiles. So, and then you can start coming up with a mathematics for some sort of fair affirmative action that's based on this. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but that's the way I think about individual versus group.
And Iris?
I'm going to go back to kind of build the arc where I started, that I would argue that it is going to be much harder to try to de-bias every individual police officer's mind as compared to trying to de-bias an organization. And so therefore, I would argue that we can decide as a society whether racial profiling is what we want to see happen or not. And I'm not saying it's easy to always prove. I mean, it's hard to prove. But at least we can have that discussion, and then we can think of mechanisms which will, for example, de-incentivize racial profiling or punish racial profiling if we decide as a society that's a bad thing to do. So we have to get much smarter about understanding the incentives, the mechanisms in our organizations, and also understanding kind of the cognitive, capabilities that we have. We have to make it relatively easy for people to do the right thing. So I think police officers try to do the right thing, and as a professor at Harvard, I'm not trying to at all point fingers at anyone. I'm trying to do the right thing. But if I didn't have a scribe in my classroom, I might actually be more likely to call on certain groups. In my particular case, I don't hear well on my right ear, so it turns out I was discriminating against my right side. So without somebody actually being there and counting, I wouldn't have known. And so that's why I'm a big fan of measurement and then debiasing the environment and make it easier for me to live the values that I have in the classroom as in not discriminating against anyone.
So one of the things on which the panelists have all agreed is that the values seem to be necessarily coming from someplace outside the AI system.
Yes.
And so we're not quite at the stage where we're displacing humans altogether. So on that sort of a note, I'm terribly sorry for the people who didn't get to ask their questions tonight, but we are guests of the forum and we do have to leave the place at a certain point and people have other things to do. So let me thank all of you for your attention, for your participation, and hope that you will join me in thanking our excellent panelists this evening.